Well, I mentioned on my last podcast that I was done podcasting for the year, but I had a final year thought that I wanted to share with you. In fact, I feel it's a really important thought at the end of the year, since I believe it has special relevance as we head towards the new year. So here's my thought. There is a special temptation for us to apply Mulligan thinking to our recovery at this time of the year. You're going to say what? I'll talk about more of that after the intro. Welcome.
Ready?
When it comes to porn, are you stuck, spinning out, or slipping backwards in your life? If so, then welcome to the Finding Traction podcast, a show dedicated to those who are looking to gain recovery momentum away from porn and toward the life and relationships they have always hoped for. Now, here's your host, Vern Tomke.
Well, if you are not a golfer, it may be helpful for me to explain the concept of mulligans for those who don't enjoy the infuriating pastime of golf. Now, according to Wikipedia, a mulligan is a second chance to perform an action, usually after the first chance went wrong through bad luck or blunder. Its best known use is in golf, whereby it refers to a player being allowed only informally to replay a stroke. Although it is against the formal rules of golf, it's essentially a golf do-over, like it never happened. So here's how it works. You're out with a group of your golfing buddies and you tee off, but you badly shank the ball and it heads off into the trees or the water trap, where you're sure there's probably man-eating alligators, and you look sheepishly at your golf buddies and go, "Mulligan, guys? Would you give me a mulligan?" Now, depending on how generous or merciful you have been to them in the past, or perhaps how much money you have riding on this hole or the competition between you, you may or may not be granted a mulligan. Now, here is another type of mulligan that you might apply in golf. This is where maybe your golf buddies fail to see that you miss an attempt to hit a ball, let's say, out of a sand trap. They never even notice. So you just pretend that you never did that previous shot and you hit the ball again. But none of us would ever do that, right? So it's interesting. Some people still insist that golf is the last honorable sport left. What I mean by that is in golf, it demands that players keep their own scores, which I guess requires a certain kind of honor, which makes cheating in golf such an unforgivable sin. In fact, back in 1891, some British dude by the name of Robert Forgan said this: "Golf is a test of temper, a trial of honor, a revealer of character. It affords a chance to play the man and act the gentleman." Now, I know all that seems a bit rich, and enough about golf, but let's talk about mulligan thinking and how it applies to recovery, especially recovery here at the end of the year. Recently, in one of my Finding Traction groups, the guys that I was working with, we were talking about some of our stinking thinking and some of the denial mechanisms that work against our progress away from porn. You know, I'm always, I love working with guys because I always get new fodder for podcasts. And sometimes I hear things that go, you know, I never actually thought of that, or I never heard of that before. I mean, lots of things and most things I've heard before. But every now and again, I'm going, you know, that's really creative. So here's what one of the guys said. He said, you know what? As we get closer to the end of the year, I tell myself that what I do doesn't really matter. Let's say I have maybe a week left in the year or a few days left in the year. So maybe those year-end porn binges, they don't really matter. Why? because I plan to get things off to a brand new start in a brand new year. In other words, I think I'm going to give myself a mulligan for this last week or two of the year because I'm going to turn things around in January. Well, what is that? That's, of course, Mulligan thinking. In other words, what I do for this last week or two of the year doesn't really count or matter. Now I'm going, that is pretty creative, but, if I'm being honest and you're being honest, I think we all have probably our own versions of Mulligan thinking that give us permission to act against our recovery and best interests. So here's the question. Where does Mulligan thinking sabotage your recovery? You see, I have certainly known and practiced Mulligan thinking myself. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Let's say you end up edging, or maybe even taking a look at something which is definitely out of bounds for you. And what you do is you say, oh, well, there I go, I've crossed the line. And so you tell yourself this thinking, well, since I've already crossed the line or crossed my boundaries I've set out for myself, and now maybe because of things I've put in my life, I now need to tell let's say my accountability buddies or partner or whatever that is. So, I have to say, I've already been read or I've already crossed my boundaries. So what does Mulligan thinking do? It says, well, I might as well go all the way or really indulge because it doesn't really matter because it's just an extension of the same mistake I've already made. In other words, everything I do between now, where I've just crossed the line, and confession time is really just one long mulligan. I think we've all probably, tried that one or had that thought, that mulligan thought, really play with us and work against our best interests. So the question again is, where does Mulligan thinking sabotage your recovery? Here's one I tried in the past. I thought it was rather creative. I heard the sex addiction guy, Doug Weiss, a therapist, talk about how powerful it is when we orgasm to porn because the orgasm glues or bonds our brains to what we are looking at. It reinforces those neural pathways. You've heard that before, right? So here's what my Mulligan thinking did. It says, you know what? I can go ahead and arouse myself, or I can stimulate and look at stimulating things as long as I don't actually have an orgasm. It's kind of like a mulligan. See, I can be pretty creative as well. Once again, where does Mulligan thinking get you in trouble? I think there's all sorts of ways, and I'd really encourage you, to let me know what maybe your creative way or maybe your unique way. I still can be surprised as I work with guys in recovery. So you might say, okay, well, that might be how this, train of thinking works against me. Is there a counteractive thought that I need to employ to combat that kind of thinking? Well, here's one. Let's say you're just, you're driving your vehicle towards a destination and you're using, Apple or Google Maps. And for some reason you fail to follow the instructions that you're given. Now, let's not even get into when they give you faulty instructions. But that's another whole discussion. But let's just say, you're supposed to take an exit and you fail to take an exit. Or, you miss a turn off, or you turn left when you should have turned right, whatever that is. And now you are heading down the road in the wrong direction, away from your desired destination. And as you continue to drive down the wrong direction, your map app is probably telling you, take the next exit, or when safe to do so, turn around. There's a fancy word for that, metanoia, from the Greek, but that's another topic. But, when safe to do so, turn around. But you go, no. I'm already on the wrong road. I might as well keep driving. Would you do that? Of course you wouldn't. You would go the next exit. I'm going to get off this road as quick as possible. Why? Because, no great surprise, the longer you go down the road in the wrong direction just means the longer distance, the more gas that you're going to have to take, the more time it's going to take to return to your desired destination. Right? Here's another one for maybe you experienced skiers. For those who've ever skied out of bounds, which I know is unsafe, but you find yourself skiing down an area from which there's no exit. There's nothing worse than having to take your skis off and having to trudge back up the hill in deep snow to return to a safe run serviced by a ski lift. It doesn't work to say, well, I'm just going down this hill. I know I'm going down the wrong road. Why? Because you're going to make the return trip much harder. That's assuming, of course, that you don't ski over a cliff. There's an old saying that says, when you find yourself in a hole, do what? Stop digging. Why? Because you're only getting deeper. Why? Because things can get worse. You're now seeing new images, new things that stick in your mind. You're furthering pathways in your brain. You're making your recovery more difficult. It's going to require more gas, more effort, more time to get back to the same place you were before. So, as we come to the end of our year, the question is, in what ways do you practice Mulligan thinking? And what new sort of thoughts or strategies do you need to apply so that thinking no longer continues to lead you in the wrong direction? And let me finally say, if you want things to get better rather than worse, here's an idea. Send me an email, bandofbrothers.care@gmail.com. And maybe you have a form of Mulligan thinking that is creative and unique only to you that I could share on the podcast. But even better, hopefully it will help you get your recovery back on track and heading in the right direction. We'll see you next time.